Hey guys, what's going on? RetroGamer here, and welcome back to another review featuring the Super Famicom. So, the Super Famicom first hit the shelves of Japan on November 21st, 1990, and then a little while after that, on August 23rd, 1991, North America, and saw a retail value of 25,000 yen in Japan and $200 in North America. Now, I know that this is basically just the Japanese version of the Super Nintendo, but I like to review these Japanese consoles because a lot of times games don't get ported over to America. And so there are a lot of exclusive games on like the Nintendo Famicom, the Super Famicom, and a lot of these other Japanese consoles. There are a lot of exclusive games that never made it over here to North America. And so I think of these as somewhat of their own consoles because they have a lot of exclusive games and you can only play them usually on original hardware, or sometimes with the Super Nintendo you can play games on there. But that's why I like to review these things. I want to show you guys what's out there, and I want to show what you can do in terms of playing the games that never made it to us here in North America. But with all that out of the way, let's take a look at some of the features of the Nintendo Super Famicom. So taking a look at the Super Famicom, it is quite different in terms of design from the original Super Nintendo. I do have my Super Nintendo on hand here, just to show a little bit of comparisons. And you see they're quite different. The Super Famicom is much more rounded. The Super Nintendo is much more boxy. There's a lot of differences going on with color and the purple buttons, just the standard buttons. There's a lot of things going on differently, but that's pretty much what we need to see for the Super Nintendo. Looking a little more on the Super Famicom, we see it has the 1 and 2 ports. It says Super Famicom up here. This is the little light for when the power's on. You switch power up and down to turn it off and on. The big eject button, the reset. Up here is the cartridge port where you put the games, the little Super Famicom logo. On the sides, nothing a whole lot going on the sides. As we look in the back, we see it has pretty much all the ports on a Super Nintendo, the AC in, the channel switch, RF, and then the port for the AV out. And that's pretty much it on the Super Famicom. So in terms of the controller, they're pretty much the same. There are a couple differences for the Super Famicom controller. As it says Nintendo Super Famicom, the buttons are colored instead of just on the Super Nintendo controller. They were purple, much like to match the console itself. And the two buttons, the Y and X, are not indented on the Super Famicom. I kind of actually like the way they're indented on the Super Nintendo controller. It feels nicer to me. And you'll also notice that the cords are shorter on the Super Famicom controller. Cords are usually always shorter on consoles in Japan. Really kind of strange, but it's a lot shorter than this. You can see this is coiled up, and this goes about 6 feet. I think the Super Famicom controllers only go about 3 feet. But other than that, it's the exact same D-pad, ABXY, start and select, and then L and R triggers up here. So there's nothing too much different in terms of there. And everything else is the same with the AC and the AV in, just the standard one for the GameCube AV in, the Nintendo 64 AV in, and all that. But if we look at the cartridges, they are a little differently shaped. As you see, the cartridge slot is a little rounded, other than the Super Nintendo. And so here are the standard carts these came in. I took these two out specifically because with Super Famicom games, a lot of times the fronts look good, but if you look up here, the backs tend to fade out a bit. Kind of odd how they tend to fade. But if we just look at one Super Famicom cart, yeah, see it's a little rounded. And if you put it in here, you just pop it right in. Then when you want to take the game out, you eject the game. And that's pretty much it there. If we look at a comparison, we see here's a Super Nintendo cart and a Super Famicom cart. So they are quite a bit smaller, so these won't fit in here, and you can't play American games, you can only play the Japanese games. However, that is a little different when it comes to the Super Nintendo. So with the Super Nintendo, the only means of lockout on a Super Nintendo is in the cartridge slot. On the cartridge slot, there are two tabs. There's one there that I took out, and then there's one there that I took out. They're just plastic tabs that you can just break off or cut off or whatever you want to do with it. And so when you take those out, you can put in a Japanese game. It gets in, and then you can play. You can play any Super Nintendo or Super Famicom game in the Super Nintendo. And that's one of the ways you can do that if you want to play Japanese games on your Super Nintendo. If you don't want to import the hardware. Now, I always recommend the hardware just because I really like playing it on the actual hardware. But if you want to play exclusives, you can do that method, or you can buy the actual hardware. Or if you don't want to cut those tabs out, because some people don't like cutting those tabs out, they want to keep their Super Nintendo original, you can possibly, I've seen people swap the boards on these cards over to a Super Nintendo cartridge. You can do that. That's kind of a pain. Emulation's also an option, but just doesn't feel the same. The Super Nintendo Online has a couple games that you can play on there, but if you're wanting to play specific games, most likely you're going to have to buy the game carts. But if you want to do it that way, yeah, you can. The easiest way is just to mod your Super Nintendo to play the games, but the Super Famicom is also a great option. It has a great library of games. A lot of times with games that came out in America, like Super Mario World or Super Mario RPG, a lot of those games are usually cheaper in the Japanese version just because no one really cares too much about the Japanese version. So you can usually find a lot of games cheaper if you're willing to go that route, whether you know Japanese or you don't really care if it's Japanese text. So that's really a great option. I've done that a lot with my GameCube, with my Super Famicom, just because there's a lot of games in America that are really expensive, but their Japanese counterpart are really cheap. So that's also an option as well. But if you're looking to pick up a Super Famicom in 2020, then I would highly recommend it. These are not terribly expensive, and there's a great library of games. But if you just want to do it on your Super Nintendo, if you want to mod that, that's a great option too. But as I said, if you're looking to pick this up, then I would highly recommend it. But guys, that was my review on the Nintendo Super Famicom. So guys, from RetroGamer Reflective Video, please like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you guys back here with another review. See you guys then.